Good morning, everyone. I would like to welcome you all to our site events at the Cryosphere Pavilion. Our theme for today is mountain glaciers and snow, healthy ecosystems or water resource loss. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you our first speaker, Laura Turley from the Geneva Water Hub. She's going to talk about glacier-fed rivers, building upstream and downstream climate resilience. Laura, please.
I'm gonna shout, that's for sure. But also, why don't you come forward? Yeah, we'll just come forward as much as you can. Maybe towards this way, towards the podium a little bit, and then we'll have our speakers coming up here in a moment. But for now, we'll. Great. Super. Okay. So yes, a very warm welcome to the discussion. My name is Laura Turley. I'm the Science Policy Manager at the Geneva Water Hub. This is the third session that we've been able to have here at the Cryosphere Pavilion. We've had different Swiss universities and Swiss research institutes collaborating with the Cryosphere Pavilion on a couple of topics, really highlighting Swiss higher education and its contributions to this topic. So first of all, there was an event on urbanization, and one of our colleagues who is contributing to the IPCC report on climate change in cities was sharing some of our work, and Alexandre on many of his projects. We also then had a session on the climate negotiations. One of our colleagues, Carrie Depric, has a new project studying the global stocktake, and she presented a few days ago as well here. So this is the third session of the University of Geneva and IVAG, a federal institute working on water, that we've had the pleasure to host here. And this session will be about water. It will be about fresh water in particular, and even more specifically about shared river basins and upstream, downstream relationships, which we think is central to climate change negotiations, not yet at the core of negotiations per se, but something that we think and hope will be becoming more and more important moving forward. So we have an informal discussion plan. The structure will just be, I'm going to set the scene a little bit because we don't have presentations per se, but I'm going to just set the scene with a bit of the Geneva Water Hub's thinking and a little bit of the context, and then have some excellent speakers join us in the front, and I'll introduce you in a moment when we bring you to the front. So I think if you're here with us today, you're pretty much already convinced on the intimate relationship between water and climate change. On the one hand, we have this very destructive side of water that as the main way that we feel climate change impacts through the proverbial, the flooding, the droughts, intense precipitation, changes to glaciers. And on the other hand, it's the way that we can build solutions through water-related projects, through water-related cooperation. And so the ways that this can work is because water is an input to so many sectors of the economy, right? To agriculture, to industry, to many of the renewable energies that we require to deal with climate change. Water is a central input. So this is, in that sense, it's also a connector because it connects so many sectors, and because it connects rivers quite literally flowing from upstream to downstream. And I've been delighted to see, walking through the pavilions anyway, how many sessions are really directly dealing with water issues. It's my first COP, so I was, kind of keeping track of all the water sessions. But because I'm a water person, I also see that literally all of the sessions relate in one way or another to water. So I'm happy to see this. There's been lots of organizations that have been advancing this agenda, lots from Sweden and others, advancing the agenda of water in the negotiations. There's been, into the negotiations, it's more through the adaptation pathway, where we see more and more attention to water-related adaptation indicators, for example, that need to be included under the global goal for adaptation. So that isn't to say that the space is full now. We haven't figured it all out for water and climate change. I think there's still a lot of need for more research, for local contexts to be brought to these forums to understand a lot of the nuance as well. So just by way of introduction, last year at the Geneva Water Hub, we published a short policy brief. Well, policy briefs are meant to be short, where we laid out some of our thinking and sort of areas where we thought we can contribute to climate change negotiate discussions. And what we started with was actually just a mapping of where we see the water and climate communities. So on the first instance, we see quite a large group of organizations, scholars, working on climate security. We also see this perspective being advanced through the IPCC reports, notably assessment report number 5 and 6, really focusing on the security side of things. So the main line of reasoning there is resource degradation, scarcity, leading in one way or another to conflict, either directly because communities are conflicted over a resource that's producing, degrading, or indirectly through migration, a population that, as a result of climate change, needs to move elsewhere, putting a strain on a resource somewhere else. Some of the science behind climate security is a bit divided because it's not a very clear, it's not a causal link. We at the Geneva Water Hub are quite adamant on the point that we're not talking about a very clear causal link where climate change is leading to conflict. On the other hand, we think it's more kind of related to the social vulnerabilities side of things. Another big community we mapped out was the water adaptation community, for lack of a better word. So here we're really seeing water as a connector and as a delivery mechanism for the adaptation goals. And just like I was referring to before, the organizations that are really advancing this thinking on what type of indicators we need to be including for adaptation are here in this space. And I'd say it's maybe the most dominant community at events like a COP. And then finally, in academia, particularly, although some organizations as well are taking a more social vulnerabilities perspective, where it's really about the social, political, and economic vulnerabilities that underlie most water crises. And so, like I said, at the Geneva Water Hub, we think this vulnerability lens can be quite revealing and quite important for us to pay attention to, because what kind of things does it reveal if we're looking at things, if we're using a vulnerability lens? It can reveal that some groups in society are more vulnerable than others for social, political, religious reasons. It can reveal that it's our institutions, our rules and regulations that we've inherited from the past that can be quite outdated for a number of reasons and need to be brought into line with our current priorities and our current challenges. So many of the water infrastructure operations, for example, are operating for purposes that were defined 50 years ago, 60 years ago, that are no longer actually in line with our current problems and our current priorities. A vulnerability lens quickly brings our attention to power dynamics and how in a basin, power dynamics are central, but also at a more local level in terms of who traditionally has been, granted water access and permits, for example. And a vulnerability lens also brings us to think about the degradation of ecosystems that is happening. And then climate change comes on top of these factors and makes the situation that much worse. It comes and it's aggravating, it's exacerbating these issues. So I'm not sure exactly what the photo is on the bottom right, but to say it's a tailing pond that hasn't been well managed. And then we add to that the exacerbating forces of climate change, and we get to the real human devastation that we're used to seeing in the media now. And so that's sort of the thinking on there. I did want to say that we'll turn to the main topic of today's discussion is about basins and upstream, downstream dependencies, upstream, downstream relationships, and what we can do to make them more resilient. We're not going to focus only on the cryosphere, but because we are in the Cryosphere Pavilion, I did want to take a few minutes to just present that context. And it is a really relevant context in the sense that it's a symbol so often for the water cycle, first of all. That one of the first things we learn about the water cycle is that picture, right, of the mountains and the rivers running down to the sea. And now it's become a symbol of climate change with melting glaciers. So the World Water Development Report this year will be on mountains and water, cryosphere and water. And I had the pleasure of reviewing it, and it's excellent. It'll be coming out soon. And then in addition to that, the United Nations General Assembly has dedicated the next decade as a decade of scientific research on the cryosphere, cryospheric sciences. So we think that it's also, great to bring attention to this particular environment. And as a Swiss-based organization, it's relevant to us. I personally live in the Swiss mountains, and so this actually strikes quite close to home, quite personally as well. So we have a scientist with us today, and he's going to fact check me and maybe add in some of his thoughts at the end. But the cryosphere is part of the Earth's surface where water exists in solid form. So that means it's the glaciers, the ice caps, snow cover, frozen soil, and sea ice. And it plays a crucial role in climate sensitivity and feedback mechanisms. So there's a lot of science that has converged on particularly the issue of melting glaciers. So recent WMO has really confirmed that the mass of glaciers around the world has indeed been decreasing. More than that, there's also decreasing snow cover, permafrost thaw, and a more erratic snowfall patterns. There was a session, I believe, Otto, we had a session on the disasters that are related to cryosphere by the Adaptation at Altitude program here a few days ago. And so these disasters include floods, glacial lake outbursts, floods, landslides. And so these are some of the common upstream glacial related disasters we're seeing more and more of, and they're all projected to increase significantly. What's less consistent around the world is the relationship that has with downstream flows. Snow melts generally tends to be a greater contribute to downstream flows than melting glaciers per se. But in some basins, it is really a glacier-driven system, whereas in other basins, it's more either snow melt-driven or monsoon-driven. But in any case, the upstream-downstream linkages are clear, and glaciers have quite a stabilizing force in many river basins because the way that they store water and release it slowly through the summer months is actually a lifeline because it comes in that slower melting mechanism rather than through immediate rainfall and immediate downstream flooding. So in any case, the melting of glaciers has pretty significant downstream impact, and it's rivers' ability to buffer those impacts. And then there's also a timing issue. As instead of snow, if rainfall is coming instead of snow, again, the timing downstream is more immediate. And then the large agricultural communities that often depend on more stabilized flows throughout the year are very likely to be impacted. So from a sort of a natural science perspective, the upstream-downstream relationship is quite nuanced. And if we add into that all of the more social aspects of river basin governance, like arguably we go from nuanced to quite complex. So I'm going to open it up to our discussion now and ask our speakers to come up, because the upstream-downstream relationship here can bring in different communities, can bring in different countries, different uses, and we have power relationships along the basin as well, different geographical, financial capacity to act. So I'm going to ask the panel to come up. We can just maybe move your chairs up, and they're going to help us enlighten this relationship between upstream and downstream dynamics. So first of all, can I ask Mr. Guy Bonvin, who's the deputy head of the mission and of regional cooperation for the Swiss Embassy to the Republic of Azerbaijan and to Turkmenistan. So we can bring your chair here, and that way we'll... Thank you, Mr. Guy Bonvin. Tanvir, would you mind bringing your chair as well to the front? Mr. Tanvir Kabir is a counselor for science, technology, and climate diplomacy for the Embassy of Bangladesh in Germany. We have Dr. Alexandra Hedjazi, who's a senior lecturer at the Institute for Environmental Sciences at the University of Geneva, and he's also the director of our Global Environment Policy Program. And last but not least, Thomas Rebermark, He's the director of the Swedish Waterhouse. And feel free to readjust now that we have the space here. So please feel free to come in. And I guess I'll take a chair too, actually, if I could. Mind if I take that one? Are they still up? Can I still have the slide? So for the discussion, just wanted to structure it around some broad buckets for discussion today. And first, I wanted to talk about some more specific where Switzerland is active in basin management, basin governance. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, thank you for being part of this panel. I think I will focus quickly on two things. I mean, one thing is the Rhone River, where we are coming from. And there, I mean, the impact on the climate change is clearly visible with the melting of the glacier and the change of pattern, and of course, also the impact, for instance, in disaster, like we had this summer, big flood impacting industrial facilities not on the valley, which has actually an impact downwards, for instance, an aluminium factory impacting the railway making on the long run. But what are we trying to do here is, if I look specifically to the canton, which is the political structure for corresponding more or less to the basin in the mountain, denominated in between water delegate, which is a person able to try to capture all the challenges and the trade-offs which are necessary to make for the water, because water is, of course, as we heard before, the picture of the climate change directly. So it is impacting on the natural danger, economic infrastructure, hydropower generation. In that case, in Switzerland, also navigation, we are concerned with that. So this is an importance to take care of that. And here I would make a quick glimpse also to a traditional water system management we have in Switzerland, which is called the BIS, which is a legal framework, something like 600-700 years old. Still in place, being the bottom line of our national canton water law management and for glaciers. And I think we have a picture before of a stone divider, and I not fully agree with you, and all arrangements are still valid, but need to be updated. And in that case, there is an update of this 50 years ago already on having a dam incorporating hydropower generation. But I can tell you, it's not easy. Nowadays, we have another challenge to address the change of water pattern, and it is a fight. Not with weapons, but a legal fight. And the other region I'm involved with is Central Asia. In Central Asia, where we're active, this is more or less the same question. You have to make trade-offs between different countries, 5 countries or 6, including Afghanistan, how to arrange the downstream, upstream interest in having a complete change of precipitation patterns. And this is really headache. Where they have a structure to discuss with governance and to these, of course, national pride, different interests, different culture, different way of approaching things. Usually we according, I would say, sedentary culture, with more cattle approach, and where you have nomadic culture, basically upstream like killers. And this is two ways of seeing adaptation and ways to handle that with your neighbors, making the deal. And I think, yeah, after that, Alexander would probably speak about cascade. But we see similar pattern here being based at the Swiss embassy. I see similar pattern of the blue river, which is outflowing in the cascade.
Something I really picked up from that is in both of those contexts, in Switzerland and in Central Asia, there are these different levels of relationship with the water. On the one hand, we have local communities that have been managing water as collectives for a long time, and then we have as well, and they both have infrastructure implications, and then we have bigger infrastructure projects managing for different uses and how to kind of marry different scales as well.
If may quickly react on that, these different scales is extremely difficult to manage because the communities or infrastructure have to take decisions at the local level. But at the end of the day, it's also a matter of managing this common good, and there's your keyword here, common good. But at the same time, it's important of the financing. How do we distribute investments or possibly subvention or grant, in other words, or grant? And here, I mean, this climate conference, there's a big discussion on how much money and how much is going to adaptation. And then I'm sitting in this negotiation. It's important to have this whole cascade and to convince to act at every level, from the big mobilization and to the very concrete project at the I would say grassroots level or river border level, and not excluding each other. That's quite important, not excluding each other, because the community in the mountains, at the end of the day, they are viewed in terms of what is happening down the river. Lake of Geneva is a good example. We have only 2 countries here. Geraldine is not here, but I think it is important to consider the whole cascade. And for us, Switzerland, we have an interest that there is no accident at a nuclear power plant, which is depending on the water we are sending them. And this is depending back on the glacier, and the glacier are our natural dam. Of course, we have physical or man-made dam, but the whole relation between 2 countries and globally. And here I'm speaking about knowledge, and I'm speaking about risk and nuclear power plant. So this is the whole chain. And the investment in the mountain has a positive impact downstream.
Yeah, thank you so much. And for those little additional insights from the Rhone, because for the record, we did also have another speaker, Geraldine, a woman as well, who was meant to join our panel, just for the record, but she unfortunately was called into the negotiations. But we'll maybe move along down the line here. Tanvir, please, basin insights from your part of the world where the stakes are high, Bangladesh.
Good morning, all. Sorry, I got from home. I would love to be, having a more generic approach, like, since we are downstream country. So if we look into the case of, the Nile Basin now, and compare, we have 3 major rivers, Ganges, so our approach for Ganges, like,
No, speak up a teeny bit. No, I think if you can speak up a teeny bit more.
Oh, sorry.
Apparently, hillbillies doing on this.
So,
Bless you. Go for it.
no, for my whole voice. So my question is, like, when we look into the, Ganges Basin, now it's like, the amount of water, the treaty between Bangladesh and India, I don't think it's the right approach. To have, a more kind of equitable approach. I would say that, source to sea approach is not like, whatever India upstream country is doing, and at the end of the day, it says that, okay, you are getting water that we agreed. If we look at the data, it's okay, but it is not like the ideal case for us. If you look at the Colorado River in the U.S. Mexico case, we see that they have with a closer coordination. U.S. government even, works with Mexico in a way that whenever Mexico needs less water, then USA takes it, and whenever the other way around, US ensures that Mexico gets the water because water kind of is not a constant amount you should get. It depends on the country needs, and also in upstream countries, it's not only like you are giving water to downstream countries quantity-wise, also you are impacting the biodiversity system. You are impacting the whole, the system of livelihood. For example, in our case, in monsoon, if we get more water, then it doesn't help us. In the case of Nile Basin, if we do compare with it, the Nile GRD case, I would say that, Egypt has got a valid kind of observation. What is the problem? The problem is the international kind of arrangement or doctrine that equitable and reasonable utilization of water. That's the problem. How you define reasonable? You can't define this. It's so subjective, right? When upstream companies would use it at their own cost, whatever happens in Nile Basin, for example, GERD project, don't we have other ways of generating electricity? We do have. We do have a lot of land in that region to produce electricity from other renewable sources. It should not be only water from hydroelectric projects. So what's going to happen? It's going to impact the Mediterranean Sea. Now there are scientific researchers. It shows that contaminants from industry, from agricultural field, are going to the Mediterranean because of the water flow and upstream. That means we can't alienate the river system from the sea water. Europe would never be kind of in a position that, okay, this is not my case. This is the case of Nile, Africa. Mediterranean is impacted, Europe is impacted, France is impacted, and many other Mediterranean countries, Italy is impacted. So if we do not reach a consensus, I would say that there will be more conflicts because water is the river water is not only river water, surface water is also connected to aquifers. That means we do not have consensus that aquifers are going to be also affected. For example, in our case, we say MDGs that we should achieve 97% access to clean water. This is not true. If you go into the research, it's around 50% of people population have lost safe water, not 97%. Yes, 97% of our population in Bangladesh has got access to water. That means tubal-based water, but not safe water. And we are heavily dependent on being a water-rich country, heavily dependent on aquifers, not the surface water. That means we do not have enough surface water that we can use for irrigation, we can use for drinking. If we look into the upstream country like Afghanistan, the same area. Yeah, the same thing is happening there. They are building canal, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. They're saying that no, whatever you are doing is gonna impact us. But if you look into the 70s, Afghanistan was not included in Almaty Convention. It's Soviet, then Soviet Union excluded them because Afghanistan was not a power at that time.
I just want to pause on something you mentioned before because I'm not sure if everyone is aware of it, but the principle of international water law is this notion of reasonable and equitable use. So the way that two states or two communities share water has to be, according to international law, reasonable and equitable. But therein lies a lot of the question, right? What are we using to define? And I wonder if we maybe not to skip, but just because Thomas has a sea-to-source approach at the Swedish Water House, and that seems to be very relevant to Tanvir's intervention. And I saw you nodding away.
Yes.
So please, if you could tell a little bit about this.
I very much agree to what you said, and we are engaged in this source to team concept, the source to team platform, and to us the governance structures are, as you say, very much hindering us from taking the steps necessary. I would say that the relationships and the agreements or the resolutions are too fragmented between and silos, so it doesn't help when you look from a source or land perspective all the way down to the sea and everything in between. So you're very much sort of promoting and advocating for a higher degree of cross-sectoral, but also community dialogues on how we can evolve together. And there's also, we have a scientist here somewhere. Also, the science community, we believe that they need to approach each other much more. I was in the Ocean Pavilion yesterday, and we have since a few years taken steps from the freshwater community to the ocean community, but we're still just saying we would like to be friends. We would like to work with you, but also having now an idea of what we can do. And I think looking into science, for example, I believe very much in the data and that we can take those steps forward in terms of regulations and policies, etc., and needs to be fact-based, but also that the science is so specific today. So if you go from a scientist in Cryosphere to a scientist in ocean, they have very little to discuss because it's so specific. The young students today, they do a brilliant job and do a fantastic sort of research, but they don't have the holistic perspective, and are neither given the opportunity to actually broaden out their perspective. And I think that could help us forward in the dialogue across and along the way from the source to the perspective.
Thanks so much, Thomas. And now I'd like to turn to Alexandre because we are currently in the Caspian Sea basin. And I don't know how much we know about the Caspian Sea, so please tell us a bit about some of the dynamics.
Thanks a lot, Laura. I don't know, Amy, if you can kindly put the few slides. It doesn't go through. Okay. I have a few slides just to show you on the map what could be seen. In any case, nothing talks as well as a map. But what we realize is that what is happening in the Caspian Sea, where the exact number is 30. Maybe I add here to talk for 3.6 million square kilometers. That's the third largest after the Amazon. We're talking about the drainage basin of the sea itself, because that's what matters when it comes to analysis of dependencies, recovery, and capacity of the sea when it comes to climate change and so on. So 3.6 million square kilometer of drainage basin, which makes it the third largest after the Amazon and the Congo basin. The basin is a very unique ecosystem from the hydrological point of view, but also more than 130 rivers. Unfortunately, I wanted to show you quite impressive 130 rivers. Feet in the watershed, 30 from very high latitudes all the way to the lower latitudes. So it encompasses part of Kazakhstan, Russia, Iran, and all the way to also Western. Approximately 14 to 15 million people have settled around the sea and within the drainage basin in a very fertile landscape. And that brings us to one of the challenges that we are facing today with the impact of climate change on the basin. And what is happening today is that as a result of land use practices, but also climate change, we see more and more the basin and the drainage basin getting close to the tipping point. which is its capacity to recover, its capacity also biodiversity outburst, and capacity to recover from irregularities. So as a result of that, what we see is that obviously the impact of climate change, lower precipitation in the region, increase in atmospheric vapor, which is basically the drying up. One important aspect or factor of impact of climate change in the Caspian Sea is the change of the wind pattern from north and western. We are more and more have eastern winds that are drier and accelerate the evaporation of the sea. So in a nutshell, the sea is getting close. Here you have the basin, the drainage, and you see that the sea itself is in the south has a much larger drainage basin with 130 rivers that are affecting and enabling or lack thereof the capacity to recover when it comes to these land use practices, but also as a result of climate change. We're getting close, very close to the tipping point. One tipping point, an obvious one, is climate tipping point, but also biodiversity. Also biodiversity has been documented and scientifically proved that there is a collapse or the decrease of the population of the Caspian seal, which is the indigenous population of the seals here, as well as amphibians and birds and so on. So we see a loss of biodiversity. We see a decrease in increase in temperature and decrease in precipitation, and this drying pattern from the winds that really, in a nutshell, or basically when we factor all this, affects the capacity of the sea to recover itself when it comes to response mechanism, natural response mechanism, and that is what matters. So when it comes to this context, we have quite a large body of protocols and conventions that brings the riparian countries of the Caspian Sea. I'm not talking about the drainage basin, and that's where the important element resides. The riparian countries of the Caspian Sea have agreed on some elements of recovery by biodiversity. There are some protocols on fishing. There are some protocols on pollution and so on and so forth. Some of them legally binding, but not all of them. But in a nutshell, what we can say is that either being a regulatory agreements or not, none of these transboundary agreements factor in climate change. And this is where we need to bring in the climate factor into the transboundary management, not only of the sea, but the drainage basin.
Yeah, thanks, Alexandre. So many of the agreements that are older don't. We start to see maybe some updates to agreements. For example, the U.S.-Mexico case, I think they're slowly starting to bring it into the treaty between the two countries. But that's fascinating. And there are five countries here that share it? Is that
So it's basically, yes, Russia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Iran are the riparian countries. But again, the drainage is much wider, and it goes beyond the sea itself.
And the general public here are quite concerned. No, I get the impression about the.
There is a raising. I mean, geek can contribute because you live here, but we have raised awareness in terms of as a result of extreme weather events. They have a higher number of sandstorm days or dust storm days, which is quite unusual for this latitude. So there is a raise of awareness. Obviously, COP29 helps also to galvanize public opinion around some of the outputs or some of the outcomes of climate change and the impact on the Caspian Sea. But what they see visually also is that some of these by the coast, some of the small islands are coming up. I mean, the lowering of the water. One important element I just forgot to mention is that Caspian Sea goes through these 4 meters cyclic fluctuation level up and down, and this is also being impacted. This natural cycle of increase and decrease of water level is also impacted by climate change. So as a result of that, and maybe you can confirm all that, is that we also see these people across Baku and beyond on the Iranian and on the Russian and Kazakh side. They see this lowering of the of the level of the Caspian Sea as a result, or the acceleration of it as a result of the compounding factor of climate change on top of the cyclic nature of the fluctuation.
No, I absolutely confirm that. Also,
I've been asked to stand here for the video. Sorry, now I'm looking
okay, I
away.
will just confirm and then give you back the word.
Okay.
No, I just confirm that this variation historically happened many times. Now we are in the declining phase, and it has also an impact, of course, on the shores, navigation, culture, etc. And back to your point, not only the riparian state, the river coming here in Azerbaijan, originating from Turkey, passing through Georgia. The other one is originating from Armenia, making the border with Iran. So it's not only the riparian state, which are absolutely
Thank you. Yeah. I did just want to ask maybe Tanvir about this idea of upstream, downstream cascading effects. You know, when we think about disaster risk reduction, we sort of think, okay, there's a flood, let's do everything we can do to manage the flood. And then the disaster response is also very localized to a flood event. But if we're thinking about cascading effects more broadly, in fact, a flood becomes a humanitarian event potentially, which becomes an issue of food, or it becomes an issue of trade. So, but I just wonder, from the recent experience of Bangladesh in the flooding of the monsoons this past year, we see that it has an effect that goes much beyond the immediate flooding. And I just wanted to hear your thinking about cascading effects.
Absolutely. It's not like, floods are not like floods. For example, the kind of distrust. It brings distrust. It brings kind of lots of confidence among the neighboring states. I would say that, in our region, now there is a kind of process of, blaming every floods to the melting of the Himalayas, which is not true. There are researches that at least 25% is related to human interventions. So we have to have joint research. In case of Colorado or Mekong Delta, you see that the countries are participating in a very good way. They share data. In our part of the world, in GBM basin, China doesn't share data with India. India doesn't share data with Bangladesh, and we do not have any mechanism that the countries, upstream, downstream countries, are working together. And at the end of the day, as a diplomat, I feel that the hatred for each other is increasing. As a human being, you can't afford it. Like, people think that the floods in Bangladesh are related to X country, Y country. So why, as a human being, we should allow it? If we had mechanism, access to data, then people would say, no, it's not only, the intervention of X country, it is also that person, larger percentage is climate change. But people are not accepting the game of climate change anymore. And what is happening? The change in U.S. administration, or the populist politics are gaining some momentum. If we will distrust climate change, then we lose a lot of momentum in our combat to climate change. You say, okay, it's not only climate change. Maybe whatever the West is saying, the progressive politics saying, it's not true.
No. Underlying vulnerabilities.
Yes, and I would say that science diplomacy is much needed, and international communities should come forward, I would say, to change the kind of arrangement we have, doctrine we have, to a more responsible doctrine, like equitable, not responsible, could be not affecting the other, or whatever is for the nature.
That's a really great segue. I think the next two kind of clusters of questions we can kind of group together and maybe go through each of the speakers one more time, because the next part I wanted to turn to was, instead of these kind of negative cascading effects that we can see, for example, a flood in Bangladesh then turns into diplomatic tension upstream. So it's not only flowing downstream, right? There are aspects that flow back upstream. But how can we think about it in terms of building resilience, really? So what measures can be taken moving forward to make this a more resilient, make more resilient upstream downstream relationships? And then specifically, I wanted to know about the role of diplomacy, because indeed both Guy and Tanvir are active diplomats. And so you've already mentioned science diplomacy, but maybe we could go maybe from the end down to here, just with your final sort of thoughts on building upstream downstream resilience.
I'm going to be a bit specific.
Okay, please.
So we have an initiative together with a global pharmaceutical company. What we're going to do is that we're going to measure the upstream and the downstream effects from communities where people live and use medicines or breathe or whatever, to see the effects, because we know how much we flush out through ourselves into the water. So if we can measure the effect by data and then reduce and also work together with the utilities to more efficiently measure, but also take measures on how to filter and clean and make the water more resilient, but also sustainable.
Where will you be doing this work? Can I ask?
Yeah, the pilot project hasn't started yet,
Okay.
but it will be probably in Sweden and Germany.
In Sweden, Germany.
Yeah, so that's where we're looking for.
Great.
But it's a kind of an activity that we do also related to the source to sea work on the platform, to see how can we move this forward by actually having pilots, even though we're a policy institute, but this is the way we can relate the policies to activities, and also gather the utilities, the pharmaceutical sector, the stakeholders in the communities, to have collective action around something that is very concrete and can have a true impact directly in measures that they can follow.
Thanks so much. And it makes me realize we've fallen a little bit into the trap of talking a lot about water flows and quantities, whereas water quality in these upstream downstream relationships is equally as important. And so it sounds like your project might take this into account, which is great. Did you want to interview, or should we come to, yeah, please go ahead next.
I wanted to react. I think it's important. Water diplomacy is a teamwork. I mean, it's not only diplomat. Okay, I'm an engineer by background. It's economist, is also ethnograph, I don't know, sociologist. It's important always to build. If we don't put only the legal side, it doesn't work. We need also somebody some people who really understand the reality at a different level. This is one thing. In terms of, I would say, solutions, okay, building team, that's the way you are explaining. And the other point for me is also, I would say, this data. And data, I go to remote sensing. Remote sensing is a way to put everybody on the same page. And we saw it very clearly in Central Asia. Where you have this data coming from the sky, somehow calibrated, then you stop to hide. You start to discover. That's another thing. And maybe a last comment also on solutions is not reinventing the wheel. Because there are many agreements existing in different places, naming Senegal, naming what we have in Europe. I think it is important to exchange this know-how and say, you, that basin, you have that construction problem. At the end of the day, glacier problem is a construction, man-made issue. This is an economic issue. This is a power game issue. This is nature. Nature is the same. At the end of the day, the physical reality is the same. And I think it is, and the social reality might be different, but at the end of the day, it's always competing system to make it under one roof. And I think it's important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
I just want to bounce back on what Guy just said, and also you said in terms of the importance of the tools that we have at our disposal. One thing that comes to my mind is for the Caspian Sea, the importance of It's remote sensing, as you mentioned, the tools that are at disposal with the technicality and the high capacity of rendering and observation. We can push things very much forward, but we also still need the in situ sampling, the basic data that will confirm some of the results that we can get from these unbelievable tools in terms of efficiency. One thing, interdisciplinarity is extremely important when it comes to scientific knowledge, but also intersectoral solution build-up. And you mentioned pharmaceutical, but other sectors of activities. Agriculture is a big user of water. And when we look at the Caspian Sea, the fertile ground, the lands of Caspian Sea, you see that the impact can be tremendous if you connect the dots across the sectors, but obviously data being driven by different disciplines. And when it comes to solutions, really anchor the solutions in mitigation and adaptation when it comes to climate change, so that we see across the boundaries the real win-win model. We're both on the mitigation, but mostly on the adaptation these days. We can move forward with sharing of the data, with possibly a single repository of the data, and sharing of the knowledge that is coming out of the data. With Port of Baku, Nursa Farooq is here today. We, the Caspisnet that I'm co-chairing, launched a center on climate resilience. And one of the main elements of the success of this center is that other countries, riparian countries of the basin, including those of the watershed, join this effort, put at the disposal the data, collect the culture of data culture comes really as the basis of this, the functioning of this platform. And one last thing is really try to see how we can bring this win-win kind of new narrative, positive tipping points, not only negative tipping points, to the general public, so that they can embrace in a very tension-ridden and conflictual geopolitical context. They can, across all the boundaries and political boundaries, they can embrace the outputs and the positive tipping points and the outcomes as a result of this collaboration. And this is what is until now missing. We hope that at least for the Caspian Sea, we can move forward with that kind of sharing philosophy and sharing practice.
I love how we got to really operational points there. And I would just add to that too, again, this piece about so many rivers are largely dominated by infrastructure, right? And so on the operational point of view as well, thinking about water infrastructure systems and how they can be, their operations can be updated to reflect new needs in collaboration with data, I think is a really important way forward in most basins. So with that, I just want to thank everyone. I'm happy to stay, and I think we have the space for a few more minutes. So if you have questions, I'm happy to let the discussion go, but I know some people have quite a tight. So thank you so much for joining, and thank you especially to our speakers for enlightening us from different perspectives and approaches. So thank you. Thanks very much.
I was hoping also to ask a question,
Yes,
because he knows Caspian Sea better than me.
Why do you have only Maine on your pen?
But as I mentioned, one of our female speaker was called into negotiations.
Oh, okay.
So we had a female speaker.
We had a problem.
Yeah, we had a problem there, but fair point.
You pushed me to ask a question.
It wasn't about the
But it was, I think it's very, very obvious. I mean, these diplomatic solutions, you only get, it's what you said, you need some pressure from below. I mean, you need to explain what you're doing, and every day you cannot be complicated. You need to translate whatever you do into something which is understood by everybody. And I think that's a daily. I think we have hundreds of bubbles bubbling around here, and unless you get some thing on connections to the ground,
I think that must be particularly challenging for diplomats who are expected to cover many, many, many topics in their work, and then engage in water in a way that's meaningful. I think that must be
But that's maybe what you guys do at the
Geneva
at
Water
the
Hub,
Geneva
indeed,
Water Hub
yeah.
to connect the dots from the diplomacy of the water
Yeah.
all the way to connecting to the on-spot kind of gains that we can make and to galvanize the various stakeholders' opinion. That's
Yes.
the output of that collaboration.
Yeah, thanks for that. Any other questions or?
If I can say, I wish Martina Klimes would have been here instead. It's one of my most esteemed colleagues who works in water diplomacy.
Okay.
And she's written an excellent book together with other authors, scientists as well. And it's called From Dialogue to Action, and it's about water diplomacy.
Okay.
So I can just give you a recommendation, and I wish that she had been here instead of me. She's still on parental leave, but coming back in December, so I'm very happy.
From dialogue to action. Okay. Thank you.
What's her name? Martina Klimes. I'm happy to share if you're sending anything out afterwards, so we can share, or we can talk afterwards. Yeah.
Because you mentioned it, Alexandre, we had that the Geneva Water Hub. We recently have been using a small grant to support recent researchers studying water diplomacy through their PhD, and to support them connecting with diplomatic community, with the policymaking community in Geneva and beyond. And so that's actually our first edition is wrapping up this December. They're coming to Geneva to share their projects. Some were working on groundwater management, one was working on groundwater management in Tunisia, another was working on decolonizing the discussion around water diplomacy in the Middle East, and another working at, local levels of water diplomacy. There's so much that's happening. So much of the dialogue is at the interstate level, but what does that mean for local? So it's really exciting. We'll be wrapping that up and bringing that to Geneva this December, but it's going to be happening 2 or 3 more times this grant. So, you can look out for that if you're an academic or if you know academics who on water diplomacy who could be interested with the science policy bridging.
So Laura, I have a question for you.
Okay.
Going back to what he was saying in terms of interdisciplinarity engagement across all disciplinary backgrounds. How do you think how feasible it is? You're from the policy background. We have our colleagues from climate change, chair of climate change, and so on and so forth. How do you see the feasibility of bringing all these disciplines around one topic?
Well, I am currently doing a paper actually on looking at how transdisciplinary and interdisciplinary projects in the water space are designed. I think it is happening all the time, right? So it's not a question of whether there are, for the past 10 years, there has been a lot of interdisciplinary. But what are the challenges indeed are that the 2 of the factors that we actually want to look at in the study are the design fit of the set of interdisciplinary projects. Based on the type of problem you're addressing, you might not need such a complicated interdisciplinarity. If you're looking at, if the research question is more about what is the water quality acceptable for the municipality of X, it might not need to be, a huge interdisciplinary research project, versus looking at Caspian Sea and how actors can build collective action to solve the problem. Then you need a big interdisciplinary project. So our first question is really about that fit, that question of what type of interdisciplinarity for what type of problem. So I'll be able to share results with you about that soon. And then the second one is measuring impact. Because, of course, we do have a lot of projects that are interdisciplinary, whether it's just on paper or in their practices, but with what impact? And sort of the gold standard now in interdisciplinarity is really working with end users, working with populations that are affected by the decisions as well as decision makers. But we have very few ways of still knowing what the outcomes of these projects are. In academia in particular, we think that they're the gold standard. Policymakers, not necessarily always, because policymakers, from what I understand, still like that there's a science community that tells them, and then they say, okay, the science community told me, that's what we're doing. So the extent to which actually the decision-making side actually wants from the beginning be involved in, okay, what's our research question? What are we going to... I don't think that's actually, we don't know that really yet. I think a lot of times it's more coming from academia. So those are some early reflections, but we'll have a study on it out soon. Yeah, thank
How do you view? I was thinking about this diplomacy question as well, because we know that I would say that politicians are very short-term oriented, and diplomats are they gardening the long term? They playing the long game, or are they also trapped by the politicians and the theory? How would you think?
I mean,
Diplomacy and politics.
Yeah, it's a career where they're dealing with so many topics, and then they change locations. Like proper diplomat, proper is, I think. I don't know, how much do you feel you can engage long term in something?
I'm not the good guy for that, because I'm not coming from that side, but I'm working with those. And I think as you say, the problem, they are rotating every 4 or 5 years and jumping in a different topics. So they are more on the process than on the content. I'm coming from the content side. So this is the type of diplomacy where you have much longer brief. That's the big difference in the way you shape your dialogue. And I would say we would need more people like myself, not as a person, but as an assignment, to be at the bridge between the two. Because the world of diplomacy, here we are in the UN world. And UN world has also become crazy in a way, because then you have very long process which are quite far away from the solution at the concrete level. If you look at the Water Convention, the UNEC, which is a very operative one, it's very practical. You have enough the basket or the bucket, the question, to solve the issue. Only to end up the wheel. But then the battle starts, you have professional diplomats fighting for every comma, looking at every interest, specific interest, instead of really going in the matter and say, well, this is an economic issue, this is a social issue, this is and then start to discuss the concrete things and name it by their name. And he was naming things by name. I was also naming what type as an upstream country we are an upstream. And
That's already, yeah.
But we have, my deep conviction, we need an approach of common good. But common good not limited to water. Common good, in that case, for instance, for Switzerland, you go on the Rhine, you have an interest in navigation. You have an interest on the road on energy. With Italy, the interest is much less blue. And if you have this common good, not only fighting for something, then you find the commonality. Then you find a common ground.
And I also imagine that in the case of Switzerland, the fact that it's relatively long-term foreign policy priority now, like Sweden, long may it last, when it's part of a bigger program that diplomats can follow in their careers, that's where I think a lot of the progress is.
But this is where we have the problem. I mean, the diplomats are not selected, trained, used for that, unless you are like me, coming from the topical side. I'm not the only one. There are others, like Henk from Province, and the one.
The Netherlands, country that
and the Dutch. I think the Sweden, we are also moving in that direction. The Finns,
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. That's the. But I mean, domestically, it's not easy to make it understand to our own system how to invest in such long-term. I can tell you, I mean, from inside, and I know in other countries, by far, it's not easy to understand your perspective. And I'm coming also from the side of commercial negotiation. Then you need to have a solution. That's it. Thank you.
thank you for joining. Yeah. feeling we could go on, but let's wrap it up. Where did you join us?
I